An active-duty Navy SEAL, haunted by combat trauma, was forced into isolation in the freezing Rocky Mountains. He built a wall of absolute routine just to keep the nightmares away. But one morning, he found a starving, heavily scarred German shepherd standing outside his remote cabin. The dog was terrified, aggressive, and absolutely ready to fight to the death. Most people would have chased it away or called animal control, but the soldier did not. He spent days patiently earning the broken animal's trust in the freezing cold. And when the worst blizzard of the decade hit, that same starving dog would not only force the soldier out into a deadly storm to save a trapped family, but it would also reveal an impossible secret. A secret proving that some bonds can survive a 3-year drop into enemy territory, and that sometimes the exact thing you are trying to save is the only thing that can save you. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The wind ripped through the dense canopy of the Rocky Mountains, carrying the bitter bite of a Colorado winter. Otis swung the heavy splitting axe. The steel blade bit into the oak log, splitting it perfectly down the middle. He grabbed the 2 halves, tossed them onto the growing pile, and placed another log on the stump. Otis was a 32-year-old active-duty Navy SEAL. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered and lean. A thick beard hid the sharp angles of his jaw, and a faded gray beanie covered his closely cropped dark hair. He wore a heavy flannel jacket over a thermal shirt, completely unaffected by the freezing temperature. He swung the axe again. The crack of the wood echoed like a gunshot across the empty valley. He was not here by choice. His commanding officer had handed him the keys to this remote cabin 2 weeks ago. It was a mandatory psychological leave. After his last deployment went terribly wrong, Otis returned with a tremor in his left hand and a blank stare that looked right through people. The military doctors called it combat fatigue. They told him to go to the mountains, disconnect, and find his center. They assumed the absolute silence of nature would heal a fractured mind. People often believe that peace comes directly from stillness. But for men accustomed to the chaotic rhythm of war, stillness is merely an empty room where the ghosts of the past speak the loudest. Otis knew this truth intimately. If he stopped moving, the memories caught up. So he built a wall of absolute routine. He woke up at 0400 every single morning. He ran 5 miles through the deep snow until his lungs burned. He returned, ate a bowl of plain oatmeal in silence, and spent 3 hours chopping firewood he did not actually need. He cleaned his cabin, maintained his gear, and went to sleep by 2100. Routine was his anchor. It kept him grounded in the present. He raised the axe and brought it down hard. Sweat dripped down his neck. The physical exertion felt good. It was real. It was something he could control, unlike the nightmares. Just the night before, he had woken up on the floor of the cabin, his hands gripping the rug, his chest heaving as he searched the dark room for a weapon. He had heard the deafening sound of helicopter blades in his sleep. He wiped his forehead with the back of his glove. The sky above hung low and gray. A heavy storm was brewing in the west. He needed to finish stacking the wood before the first flakes started falling. He gathered an armful of the freshly split oak and walked toward the covered porch of the cabin. As he approached the wooden steps, he stopped. He looked down at the ground near the edge of the porch. The fresh layer of snow from the previous night was disturbed. Otis lowered the logs onto the porch floor with a dull thud. He crouched down to examine the marks. They were paw prints. Large, distinct prints leading from the edge of the forest directly to his cabin steps, pacing back and forth, and then returning to the tree line. He pulled off his right glove and traced the contour of one print with his bare finger. The pads were wide. The claw marks dug deep into the frozen earth beneath the snow. This was no fox or coyote. It was massive. A wolf, perhaps. The Rocky Mountains had plenty of wildlife. But as Otis studied the stride pattern, his trained eyes noticed a strange anomaly. The animal was dragging its right front leg. The print on that side barely made an indentation, while the left side dug deeply as it compensated for the weight. Furthermore, the spacing of the prints showed a deliberate, cautious approach. A wild predator looking for food would move with pure instinct. These tracks moved with calculation. The animal had circled his perimeter, checked the access points, and retreated exactly the way it came. It was a tactical retreat. Otis stood up. He slipped his glove back on. He turned his gaze toward the dense tree line. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their dark green branches heavy with snow. The shadows between the trees were deep and impenetrable. He stood perfectly still. He let his senses expand, shutting out the sound of his own breathing and the rustling of his jacket. He listened to the forest. The wind had momentarily died down, leaving an eerie, heavy quiet over the mountain. Otis took a slow, measured step toward the woods. The snow crunched beneath his boots. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He wore a hunting knife on his belt, but he did not reach for it. He wanted to observe, not escalate. He took another step. The temperature felt as though it had dropped 10 degrees. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was a low, vibrating growl. The sound did not come from the front where the tracks disappeared. It came from the thick brush to his immediate left. The animal had flanked him. Otis froze. The growl deepened, vibrating in the cold air. It was a fierce, desperate sound. It was not the growl of a predator hunting its prey. It was the warning of a creature backed into a corner, ready to fight to the death. Otis slowly turned his head toward the brush. He did not make any sudden movements. His military training took over, slowing his heart rate, sharpening his vision. The bushes rustled slightly. A pair of eyes caught the dim light of the overcast sky. They were not the wild, frantic eyes of a rabid beast. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a profound pain. The low rumble continued, vibrating through the ground and into the soles of Otis's boots. He stood face to face with the unknown, the cold wind picking up again, whipping snow around them as the tension reached its absolute breaking point. The creature stepped out from the dense brush, its paws crunching softly against the frozen crust of the snow. Otis did not move a single muscle. His breathing remained slow and controlled. He expected a mountain lion or a stray wolf. Instead, he found himself staring at a German shepherd. The dog was a ghost of what the breed was supposed to be. Its black and tan coat was matted with pine sap, dirt, and dried blood. The animal was severely emaciated. Its ribs pressed sharply against its skin, rising and falling with rapid, labored breaths. A deep, jagged scar ran across its snout, and another thick patch of hair was missing from its left flank, revealing older, healed tissue. Otis analyzed the situation with the cold precision of a soldier. The dog favored its right front leg, keeping the weight entirely on the left. The ears were pinned back flat against its skull. The teeth were fully bared, dripping with saliva. A continuous, vibrating growl rumbled in its chest. This animal was terrified, starving, and absolutely ready to kill to protect itself. Hunger usually makes animals reckless, driving them into frantic and unpredictable actions. But this dog held its ground with a calculated discipline, proving that some training survives even the deepest starvation. It did not charge blindly. It maintained a specific tactical distance, guarding its blind spots against the trees and keeping Otis squarely in its line of sight. Otis recognized that posture. It was the stance of a seasoned fighter. "Easy," Otis said. His voice was low, smooth, and completely devoid of threat. The dog snapped its jaws at the sound, the growl spiking in pitch, but it did not advance. Otis knew that direct eye contact in the animal kingdom meant a challenge. He slowly lowered his gaze, focusing on the dog's paws instead of its eyes. He uncurled his fists and opened his hands, keeping his palms facing outward and visible. He wanted the animal to see that he held no weapons. The wind howled through the pine branches above them, sending a shower of loose snow down between them. Neither the man nor the dog flinched. Otis took a slow, deliberate step backward toward the cabin. He dragged his boot slightly in the snow to avoid startling the animal with sudden movements. The dog immediately shifted its weight, tracking Otis's movement, the growl steadying into a rhythmic hum of warning. Otis took another step back. Then another. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent his life navigating hostile territories. He did not turn his back. He kept his posture relaxed. His shoulders slumped to make himself look smaller and less intimidating. When Otis reached the wooden steps of his porch, the dog had not moved from its position near the tree line. It stood like a ragged statue in the snow. Otis backed up the steps, opened the heavy oak door of the cabin, and slipped inside. He shut the door quietly behind him. The sudden warmth of the cabin wrapped around him, but his mind remained outside in the freezing wind. He walked straight to the small refrigerator in the kitchen. He pulled out a package of raw steak he had bought at the town market 3 days ago. He tore the plastic open, grabbed a large chunk of the red meat, and walked back to the front door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. He wondered if the dog had already vanished into the woods. A wild animal would have run the moment the perceived threat disappeared. Otis opened the door and stepped back onto the porch. The German Shepherd was still there. It had actually moved a few feet closer, standing exactly where Otis had been chopping wood minutes earlier. It was inspecting the area, but the moment the cabin door clicked, its head snapped up. The defensive posture returned instantly. The teeth showed. The growl resumed. Otis did not walk down the steps. He stayed on the porch, maintaining the elevation difference but crouching down on one knee to reduce his height. He held the raw steak in his right hand. He rested his forearm on his knee, letting the meat hang visible in the cold air. "I know you are hungry," Otis said softly. The dog's nose twitched. The scent of the raw meat hit it, fighting against the instinct of fear. The animal took half a step forward, then immediately pulled back, torn between survival and distrust. Otis knew he could not force this connection. Trust in a combat zone was earned through patience, not pressure. He placed the chunk of steak gently on the top wooden step, pulling his hand away quickly. He stood up slowly. He looked at the dog one last time. He did not smile. He did not make any sudden gestures. He simply nodded, acknowledging the standoff, and then he deliberately turned his back on the animal. It was a massive risk. Turning your back on a desperate predator went against every survival instinct. But Otis understood the psychology of the wounded. He needed to prove he was not a hunter. Otis gripped the doorknob. As he pushed the door open, he heard the frantic scramble of claws on the icy wood of the steps. The dog lunged forward with explosive speed. Otis glanced over his shoulder. The dog snatched the heavy piece of meat in its jaws. But it did not retreat to eat. It stood right there on the top step, its jaws clamped tight around the steak. The animal stared directly into Otis's eyes, the low, hostile growl vibrating around the edges of the food in its mouth. It was taking the offering, but it was promising violence if Otis took one wrong step. Otis stepped inside and closed the door, leaving the dog alone in the freezing wind. The sun breached the ridgeline the next morning, casting long, pale streaks of light across the snow. Otis stepped out onto the porch. The spot where he left the steak was empty. Only a few scattered drops of frozen blood marked the wood. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest stood still and silent. But Otis knew the animal was there. He could feel the eyes watching him from the deep brush. He returned to the kitchen and cut another piece of meat. This time, he walked halfway across the yard. He stopped 20 feet from the pines. He placed the meat on a flat rock protruding from the snow. He backed away slowly and returned to his axe. For the next 3 days, Otis established a new routine. He woke up, ran his 5 miles, and then he fed the dog. He moved the feeding spot exactly 3 feet closer to the cabin each morning. Patience is not simply the act of waiting. For a soldier, patience is an active state of observation, a calculated endurance where every single second holds a specific purpose. Otis applied this strict military discipline to the starving animal. He did not rush. He did not force an interaction. He let the dog dictate the pace of their silent negotiation. On the fourth day, the dog stopped retreating into the dense woods. It stayed at the edge of the tree line, hiding within the dark silhouettes of the massive pines. Its black coat blended perfectly with the dim light. "Shadow," Otis said aloud. The dog's ears twitched at the sound. "That fits you," Otis continued. His voice was low, steady, and entirely calm. "You stay in the dark. You watch, just like a shadow." Otis began talking to the dog during every feeding. He did not use high-pitched, excited tones like people normally do with house pets. He spoke the way he communicated with his squad during a night patrol. Short, clear, and grounded. "Here. Easy now. Take it." Shadow listened. The aggressive growling slowly faded over the days, replaced by a tense, hyper-vigilant silence. The dog still favored its injured front leg. The ribs still showed through the matted fur, but the frantic desperation in its eyes began to shift into a cautious curiosity. On the fifth afternoon, the temperature plummeted. Dark gray clouds rolled over the peaks, blocking out the sun completely. The wind picked up, carrying sharp crystals of ice that stung exposed skin. A major winter storm was moving in fast. Otis walked out onto the porch, holding a thick cut of venison he had thawed. He did not walk down the steps. He sat down on the second step from the top. He rested his elbows on his knees and let the meat hang loosely in his right hand. He looked toward the trees. "Shadow, come here!" The brush rustled. Shadow stepped out into the open snow. The dog looked terrible in the flat gray light. The cold wind whipped its thin coat, making it shiver violently. "Come on," Otis said softly. Shadow took a step forward. The injured paw barely touched the ice. The dog stopped and stared at the man. The distance between them was exactly 15 feet. Otis did not move. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate just as a sniper does before pulling the trigger. He kept his eyes focused on the dog's chest, avoiding direct eye contact. Shadow took another step, then two more. The dog moved with painful slowness, calculating every inch of the open ground. 10 feet, 8 feet, 5 feet. The dog stopped at the base of the wooden steps. It looked up at the meat, then up at Otis's face. The jaws parted slightly, but no growl came out. Otis kept his hand perfectly still. "Take it." Shadow stretched its neck forward. The dog placed its good front paw on the bottom step. The wood creaked. Shadow froze, ready to bolt at the slightest sudden movement. When Otis remained perfectly still, the dog shifted its weight and climbed up one more step. They were now less than 2 feet apart. Otis could smell the wet, dirty fur and the metallic scent of old blood. He could see the jagged edges of the scar across the dog's snout in perfect detail. Shadow did not snap at the meat this time. The dog leaned in slowly. The black nose twitched, taking in the scent of the venison, and then taking in the scent of the man holding it. Instead of biting the food, Shadow moved its head a fraction of an inch to the right. The wet, cold nose gently bumped against Otis's bare knuckles. Otis held his breath. The dog sniffed his skin, reading the chemical markers of his sweat, his adrenaline, and his intent. Animals do not lie, and they do not believe lies. They read the truth in a heartbeat. Shadow read the quiet, steady calm radiating from the soldier. After a long, breathless moment, Shadow opened its jaws and gently took the meat from Otis's hand. The sharp teeth grazed his skin, but there was no pressure, no violence. The dog chewed quickly, swallowing the meat in 2 large gulps. It did not run away. It stood on the step, shivering in the freezing wind, looking at Otis with a strange, intense focus. Otis slowly rotated his right hand, keeping the palm open and flat. He reached out, moving his arm at a glacial pace. Shadow watched the hand approach. The dog's muscles tensed beneath the ruined fur, ready to spring backward. Otis stopped his hand just 1 inch away from the dog's neck. He let the animal make the final choice. Shadow leaned forward and pressed its heavy, scarred head against Otis's open palm. The thick fur was coarse and freezing cold, but beneath it, Otis felt the rapid, strong beat of the dog's pulse. A fragile bridge of trust had just formed over a foundation of shared trauma. The first heavy snowflakes began to fall, landing on the wood around them. The storm had arrived. The winter storm hit the Rocky Mountains with absolute brutality. The wind screamed through the valley, rattling the heavy log walls of the cabin. The temperature plummeted well below zero. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the window panes. Otis built a large fire in the stone hearth. The dry oak logs crackled, throwing deep orange light across the wooden floor. He sat in an armchair, watching the flames. But his mind remained outside, on the freezing porch. He stood up and walked to the front door. He turned the handle and pulled it open. The wind immediately blasted into the room, bringing a swirl of white snow and biting cold. Shadow lay curled in a tight ball in the far corner of the porch. The dog shivered violently. Snow covered its matted black coat. The animal looked up when the door opened, its amber eyes reflecting the warm firelight from inside. Otis did not call out. He did not issue a command. He simply left the door wide open, walked back to his armchair, and sat down. He placed his hands on his knees and waited. He gave the dog the choice. For 10 long minutes, nothing happened. The cabin grew painfully cold. The wind howled through the open doorway. Then, a dark shape appeared at the threshold. Shadow stood in the doorway, staring into the bright, warm room. The dog took one step inside. Its injured paw touched the rug. It paused, sniffing the air, scanning the corners of the room for any hidden threats. The wild instincts demanded it stay outside in the familiar dark. The freezing body demanded the fire. Shadow took another step, then another, fully entering the cabin. Otis stood up slowly, walked past the dog, and pushed the heavy door shut. The howling wind instantly became a muffled roar. The sudden quiet felt heavy. Shadow limped toward the fireplace and collapsed onto the thick rug. The heat radiating from the stones immediately worked into the dog's frozen muscles. Otis went to the bathroom and retrieved his military medical kit. He filled a small bowl with warm water and grabbed a clean towel. He walked back to the living room and sat cross-legged on the floor, 3 feet away from the dog. "Come here," Otis said quietly. Shadow lifted its head. The dog hesitated, then dragged itself over to Otis, collapsing heavily onto the floor right next to him. Under the bright light of the fire, Otis saw the true extent of the damage. The dog's body was a map of suffering. The deep scar on the snout looked old, but the wound on the right paw was inflamed and filled with dirt. The patch of missing fur on the flank revealed raw, blistered skin. Otis dipped the towel into the warm water. He started with the paw. He cleaned the dirt away with slow, steady movements. Shadow flinched, pulling the leg back slightly. Otis stopped, waited a second, and then applied the wet towel again. This time, the dog let him work. He applied a mild antiseptic to the open cuts. The dog whined low in its throat, but did not growl. Otis moved to the flank, wiping away the grime and dried blood. He worked with the same focused efficiency he used to patch up his squad mates in the field. Trust is not built in grand gestures. It is forged in the quiet moments when vulnerability is met with care instead of violence. Otis understood this perfectly. He did not pet the dog. He simply provided the necessary care, letting the animal realize that human hands could heal as well as hurt. When he finished, he put the medical kit away. He turned off the main lights, leaving only the fire burning. He walked to his small bed in the corner of the room, pulled off his boots, and lay down on top of the blankets. Shadow remained on the rug by the fire, breathing deeply, finally safe from the freezing mountain night. Sleep came quickly for Otis, but it did not bring rest. It brought the desert. The nightmare began the same way it always did. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades filled his head. Dust blinded his eyes. The radio hissed with chaotic, frantic voices. He saw the flash of the explosion. He felt the shockwave throw him backward. He reached out to grab his teammate, but his hands grasped only empty air. Otis thrashed on the bed. Sweat poured down his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was trapped in the memory, unable to break the cycle of panic. "No!" Otis muttered in his sleep. "Grab the line! Grab the line!" He threw his arm out, striking the wooden nightstand. The impact did not wake him. The panic intensified, dragging him deeper into the dark abyss of his combat trauma. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, his body locked in a fight for survival that had ended months ago. Suddenly, a heavy weight landed on his chest. A rough, wet tongue dragged across his cheek. A warm nose pushed firmly into his neck. A low, rhythmic whine broke through the imaginary sound of the helicopter blades. Otis gasped, and his eyes snapped open. The desert vanished. The dust cleared. The radio static died. Shadow stood over him on the bed. The dog's front paws rested on his chest. The amber eyes stared directly into his face, filled with absolute focus. When Otis opened his eyes, the dog whined again and licked his chin, nudging his jaw with its scarred snout. Most animals would run from a thrashing, screaming human. They would perceive the erratic movement as a threat. But Shadow had not run. The dog had recognized the panic and moved toward the danger to break the cycle. Otis lay still, staring at the ceiling. His breathing slowly returned to normal. The violent trembling in his hands stopped. He reached up slowly and placed his hand on the side of the dog's neck. The thick fur felt real. The heartbeat under his palm felt real. "I am here," Otis whispered in the dark. "I am right here." Shadow let out a long sigh, circled twice on the end of the bed, and lay down heavily across Otis's feet. The man and the dog slept through the rest of the storm, anchoring each other to the present. The afternoon light vanished completely by 1600 hours. The winter storm did not simply arrive, it assaulted the mountain. The local radio station had called it the worst blizzard of the decade before the signal died entirely. Now, there was only the deafening roar of the wind. The heavy wooden logs of the cabin groaned under the immense pressure. The windows rattled violently in their frames. Fine white powder blew through the tiny cracks around the door hinges, piling into small drifts on the hardwood floor. The temperature outside plummeted to 20 below zero. Otis added 3 thick oak logs to the fire. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows across the room. He sat in his armchair, a mug of black coffee resting on his knee. Nature has a way of stripping a man down to his core instincts. A soldier learns to view a storm not as weather, but as an enemy tactic. It blinds the eyes. It deafens the ears. It masks the approach of a threat. Otis knew this feeling well. The sensory deprivation of the blizzard tried to push his mind back into a state of combat paranoia. But tonight, he was not alone in the dark. Shadow paced the perimeter of the living room. Otis watched the dog closely over the rim of his coffee mug. A normal stray dog, finally granted access to warmth and shelter, would curl up as close to the fire as possible and sleep until morning. Shadow did not do that. The German Shepherd moved with a deliberate, rhythmic pattern. The dog walked to the front door, pressed his black nose against the bottom crack, and inhaled deeply. He held his breath for 2 seconds, analyzing the scent. Finding nothing, Shadow moved to the front window. The dog placed his good paw on the sill and stared out into the blinding white chaos. His ears rotated independently, scanning for frequencies hidden beneath the howling wind. Once he cleared the front wall, Shadow limped toward the back door near the kitchen and repeated the exact same process. Otis lowered his mug. He leaned forward. His tactical mind registered the movements. "You are running a perimeter check?" Otis said aloud. Shadow stopped pacing. The dog turned his head and looked at Otis. He gave a short, single wag of his tail, acknowledging the voice, before returning to his patrol route. Otis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That specific behavior was not instinctual. It was trained, No civilian taught a dog to clear a room systematically. That required hundreds of hours of professional conditioning. Shadow moved like a sentry on active duty. "Who trained you, buddy?" Otis asked the empty room. Shadow finished his circuit and finally returned to the fireplace. He did not collapse randomly. He positioned himself strategically. He lay down facing the front door, keeping Otis and the fire behind him. He placed his body as a physical barrier between his human and the main point of entry. Otis stood up and walked to his supply crate. He pulled out a high-protein military ration pack. He tore it open, broke the compressed meat bar into smaller pieces, and placed them in a metal bowl. He walked over and set the bowl near the dog. "Eat," Otis commanded softly. Shadow sat up, looked at Otis for permission, and then ate the food with quick, disciplined bites. He licked the bowl clean and resumed his guard position. The hours dragged on. The storm outside grew worse. The wind sounded like a freight train rushing past the walls. Snow piled halfway up the windows, sealing the cabin in a frozen tomb. The heavy isolation pressed down on the roof. Otis eventually lay down on his bed, leaving his boots on. He kept his heavy jacket zipped up to his chin. The cold seeped through the floorboards despite the blazing fire. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the dog across the room. For the first time in months, Otis fell asleep without the chemical taste of adrenaline in the back of his throat. The change in the atmosphere woke him instantly. Otis opened his eyes. The cabin was nearly pitch black. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. He checked his watch. It was 02:15. The storm still raged outside, shaking the walls with violent gusts of wind. But something was wrong inside the room. Shadow was no longer lying by the hearth. The dog stood rigidly by the front door. His head was lowered, his ears were pinned forward, straining against the wood. Otis swung his legs off the bed. He did not make a sound. He reached down and unclipped the hunting knife from his belt. He moved silently across the room. Suddenly, Shadow let out a sharp, booming bark. It was not a growl of fear. It was a clear, authoritative alarm. Shadow barked twice more, scratching frantically at the heavy wooden door. "Quiet," Otis whispered, moving to the dog's side. Shadow did not obey. The dog turned, grabbed the fabric of Otis's pant leg in his teeth, and pulled backward. The pull was incredibly strong. Shadow planted his paws and dragged Otis toward the doorknob. He released the fabric, barked again, and shoved his nose hard against the bottom of the door. Otis knelt down. He placed his ear against the cold wood. He listened past the howling wind. He strained his senses, trying to find whatever the dog had detected. For 10 seconds, he heard nothing but the blizzard. Then the wind shifted slightly, dropping in pitch for a fraction of a second. In that tiny gap of silence, Otis heard it. It was faint. It was metallic. It was the distinct, rhythmic blare of a car horn, muffled by tons of snow and distance. Shadow whined loudly, pacing in tight circles, looking from the door to Otis and back again. The dog was begging him to open the door. Someone was out there in the deadly cold, and they were running out of time. Otis stood up. He grabbed his heavy winter parka, his snow goggles, and a coil of climbing rope. He looked down at the injured, starving German shepherd, who refused to ignore a call for help. "All right," Otis said, clipping a heavy flashlight to his chest harness. "Lead the way." Otis gripped the door handle and threw it open. The storm immediately blasted into the cabin, swallowing them both in blinding white chaos. The wind hit Otis like a physical wall of ice. He pulled his heavy snow goggles down over his eyes and adjusted the thick scarf around his lower face. The world outside the cabin did not look like a forest anymore. It looked like a chaotic swirl of pure white noise. The temperature felt sharp enough to cut through the thick layers of his winter gear. He clicked the heavy flashlight on, but the beam barely penetrated the dense curtain of falling snow. Shadow did not hesitate for a single second. The German shepherd plunged directly into the deep snowdrifts. The dog kept his black nose low to the frozen ground, tracking a scent completely invisible to human eyes. Otis followed closely behind. He used his large boots to widen the trail the dog was carving. They moved away from the safety of the cabin and entered the dense tree line. The towering pines offered a slight barrier against the raging wind, but the snow on the ground was waist-deep in several places. Otis had to use his entire body weight to push forward. He lifted his knees high, dragging his legs through the heavy powder. His lungs burned with the freezing air. Shadow navigated the treacherous terrain with a strange, brutal efficiency. The dog did not bound aimlessly the way a normal animal would in deep snow. He picked the paths of least resistance. He followed the natural contours of the land, avoiding hidden rocks and deep hollows. He moved like a creature born in this frozen hell. A soldier learns very quickly that survival on a mission depends entirely on the point man. The point man leads the squad through hostile territory. He spots the hidden traps. He finds the safest route through chaos. If the point man makes a mistake, the entire team dies. Otis realized, as he watched the dark shape of the dog moving ahead of him, that he had instinctively surrendered this critical role to a starving animal. It was a profound transfer of trust. This kind of trust happens only when words fail completely and actions take over. The blizzard howled above them. The trees groaned under the immense weight of the ice. Shadow suddenly stopped. The dog raised his head and barked once into the dark. The sound was swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Otis caught up to the dog. He knelt down in the snow. "What is it?" Otis asked loudly. The wind ripped the words away before they could even reach the dog's ears. Shadow did not look back. He pushed forward again, moving faster now. The urgency in the dog's posture was undeniable. The injured front paw did not seem to slow him down anymore. Pure adrenaline masked the pain. They reached the edge of the dense tree line. The ground sloped downward aggressively, disappearing into the white void. Otis knew this specific terrain from his daily runs. It was a steep, jagged ravine that dropped 50 feet to a rocky creek bed below. In the summer, it was a beautiful gorge filled with rushing water. In a winter blizzard, it was a fatal drop. Shadow stood at the absolute edge of the cliff. The dog leaned forward and barked aggressively down into the black abyss. Otis crawled on his stomach to the edge, distributing his weight to avoid triggering a collapse of the snow cornice. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his chest harness. He pointed the strong beam down into the ravine. The light pierced the swirling snow, illuminating the steep, rocky walls. Down at the bottom, partially buried in a massive snowdrift, sat a vehicle. It was a large SUV. It rested completely upside down on the frozen creek bed. The 4 tires pointed directly toward the sky. The metal frame was crushed inward. A thin trail of gray smoke seeped from the smashed engine block, quickly snatched away by the violent wind. The rhythmic blare of the horn had completely stopped. Otis felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The silence from the vehicle was much worse than the noise. It meant the battery had finally died, or whoever was inside had lost the ability to press the horn. He scanned the steep slope leading down to the wreck. The snow on the ravine wall was loose and highly unstable. One wrong step would trigger a localized avalanche, sending tons of snow down to bury the vehicle completely. He needed to get down there safely, and he needed to do it immediately. He looked at Shadow. The German shepherd looked back, standing completely still in the howling wind, waiting for his next order. "Good boy," Otis said. "Stay right here. Do not move." Otis retreated from the edge. He uncoiled the heavy climbing rope from his shoulder. He found a massive, deeply rooted pine tree near the rim of the ravine. He looped one end of the rope around the thick trunk, securing it with a complex tactical knot he had used 1,000 times in the field. He pulled hard on the line. It held firm against the bark. He walked back to the edge and clipped the other end of the rope to the steel carabiner on his harness. He looked down at the crushed metal shell of the SUV. The smoke was getting thicker. Otis gripped the rope tight. He nodded once to the dog. He stepped backward over the edge of the cliff and began his rapid descent into the freezing dark. Otis rappelled down the sheer drop of the ravine. The thick climbing rope burned through his heavy leather gloves. He braced his boots against the jagged rock wall hidden beneath the snow. The wind fought him every step of the way, trying to tear him off the cliff. He did not look down. He focused on the tension in the line and the steady rhythm of his descent. He reached the creek bed. The snow here was waist-deep and packed hard by the wind. He unclipped his harness and waded toward the crushed vehicle. The smell of leaking antifreeze and scorched metal filled the air. Otis wiped the snow off the shattered driver's side window. He shined his heavy flashlight inside. A man hung upside down in the driver's seat, held tightly by his seatbelt. He was completely unconscious. A woman in the passenger seat stirred weakly, her face pale and covered in blood from a severe head wound. In the back seat, a small girl, no older than 6, huddled in a torn winter coat, shivering uncontrollably. In moments of absolute crisis, the human body does not rely on hope. It relies on muscle memory and the primal urge to outlast the cold. Otis did not panic. He operated with pure tactical precision. He pulled his military knife and smashed the remaining glass of the rear window. He cleared the jagged edges with his heavy boot. "I am here to get you out," Otis said clearly. "Do not move." He reached in and pulled the little girl out first. She was dangerously light, her lips tinted blue from the freezing temperature. He set her down on the snow. He needed to keep her warm immediately, but he could not hold her while he rescued her parents. He looked up toward the top of the ravine. "Shadow, get down here." The German shepherd did not hesitate. The dog did not try to jump. Shadow found a narrow, winding goat path along the edge of the cliff. He slid down the steep incline, riding the loose snow all the way to the bottom, ignoring the pain in his injured leg. Otis grabbed a heavy thermal blanket from his tactical pack and wrapped it around the child. "Shadow, cover," Otis commanded. The dog instantly understood the order. Shadow curled his large, furry body tightly around the shivering girl. The dog rested his heavy chin on her small boots, trapping his natural body heat beneath the blanket. The girl instinctively buried her cold face into the dog's thick neck, seeking the warmth. Otis turned back to the vehicle. He crawled through the broken window. He cut the woman's seatbelt. She collapsed into his arms. He dragged her out of the wreckage and laid her on the snow next to her daughter. The father was trapped. The steering column pinned his legs tightly against the seat. Otis braced his back against the crushed roof of the SUV. He placed his boots against the dashboard. He pushed with every ounce of strength in his legs. His vision blurred from the exertion. The metal groaned, fought back, and finally snapped. The gap widened just enough. Otis cut the belt and dragged the heavy, unconscious man out into the howling wind. They could not stay in the ravine. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the snow cornice above them looked highly unstable. Otis secured the rope around the mother's waist. He climbed the rope first, pulling her up the steep incline with brutal force. His muscles screamed. His boots slipped on the icy rocks. He hauled her over the edge and laid her in the snow. He rappelled back down. He repeated the process with the unconscious father. He strapped the man to his back using a makeshift harness. Climbing 50 feet with dead weight tested the absolute limits of his physical endurance. Sweat froze on his eyelashes. His lungs felt like they were bleeding. He dragged the man over the rim and collapsed for 5 seconds to catch his breath. He went down a third time. Shadow stood guard over the little girl. The dog whined as Otis approached. Otis secured the child to his chest. "Let us go, Shadow. Climb." Shadow scrambled up the steep goat path, digging his claws into the ice. Otis climbed the rope. The wind howled furiously, blinding him. They reached the halfway point. Then a loud, sharp crack echoed through the ravine. It sounded like an artillery shell firing. Otis looked up. The massive snow cornice overhanging the cliff edge broke loose. "Climb!" Otis yelled. He surged upward, pulling the rope hand over hand, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulders. Shadow lunged forward, clearing the edge of the cliff. just as the snow gave way beneath his back paws. Otis threw his body over the rim, wrapping his arms protectively around the little girl, and rolled away from the drop. Tons of heavy, packed snow crashed down into the ravine. The avalanche buried the creek bed and the crushed SUV under 20 feet of solid ice. If they had stayed down there 1 minute longer, they would have been erased from the mountain entirely. Otis lay in the snow, breathing hard. He looked at Shadow. The dog stood nearby, shaking the snow from his coat, panting heavily. Otis unclipped the child and carried her to her parents. He picked the father up and threw him over his shoulder. He grabbed the mother by her heavy coat and supported her weight. "Shadow, lead us back," Otis ordered. The dog put his nose to the ground and found the trail they had carved earlier. They marched through the blinding blizzard for 30 agonizing minutes. When they finally reached the cabin, Otis kicked the door open. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin retained its warmth. He laid the family down on the thick rugs near the hearth. He stacked fresh wood onto the coals and watched the flames roar back to life. He covered the parents and the child in every blanket and sleeping bag he owned. He checked their pulses. The father had a strong heartbeat but remained unconscious. The mother held her daughter tightly, crying silent tears of shock and relief. They were stable, but they needed real medical attention to survive the night. Otis walked to his secure lockbox. He pulled out his military emergency satellite beacon. He pressed the activation button. A bright green light flashed, sending an SOS signal directly to the Regional Rescue Command. The sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning. The violent storm had passed, leaving a silent, pristine white world behind. At 08:00 hours, the deep thud of helicopter rotors filled the valley. The sound no longer triggered a flashback for Otis. Today, it was the sound of salvation. A bright orange Coast Guard rescue chopper hovered above the clearing, kicking up a massive cloud of powder. A team of paramedics jumped down, carrying stretchers and medical kits. They rushed into the cabin, working quickly to stabilize the family for transport. The nightmare was officially over. The family would survive. But for Otis, as he watched the medics work, the biggest revelation of the morning was yet to come. The orange Coast Guard helicopter sat in the clearing. Its massive rotors spun slowly, kicking up a fine mist of snow. The noise shattered the morning silence. 4 paramedics jumped from the side door. They carried bright red medical bags and foldable stretchers. They ran toward the cabin, their boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. Otis stood on the porch. He held the door open. A female paramedic stepped inside first. Her name tag read Sarah. She had short blonde hair tucked under a dark knit cap and wore a thick, high-visibility jacket. She moved with practiced urgency. She immediately knelt beside the little girl. Another paramedic, a tall man with broad shoulders, checked the unconscious father. "We have a strong pulse here," the tall paramedic said. "He needs a hospital, but he is stable." Sarah wrapped a heated foil blanket around the little girl. The child opened her eyes and blinked at the bright lights. She was safe. Shadow sat in the far corner of the room. The German shepherd watched the strangers carefully. The dog did not growl. He did not bark. He understood the situation. He stayed out of the way, keeping his amber eyes fixed on Otis. 2 local police officers arrived a few minutes later on heavy snowmobiles. The lead officer walked into the cabin. He was a man in his late 50s named Officer Miller. He had thick gray hair, a bushy mustache, and wore a heavy brown sheriff jacket. He carried a digital tablet and a small black scanning device. Miller took statements from the conscious mother. He recorded the details of the avalanche and the rescue. Then he turned his attention to Otis. "You did an impossible thing last night, son," Miller said. He extended his hand. Otis shook it. His grip was firm. "I had help." Otis pointed to the corner of the room. Miller looked at the scarred, emaciated German shepherd. The officer smiled gently. "I need to run a routine check on the animal. State protocol for stray dogs involved in emergency incidents. We just scan for a microchip to see if he belongs to a local farm. Otis nodded. Go ahead, but move slowly. He is traumatized. Miller approached the dog. Shadow tensed, but a single, quiet command from Otis kept the dog in place. Miller knelt down. He turned on the black scanning device. It emitted a soft blue light. He waved the scanner over the back of the dog's neck, just between the shoulder blades. The device beeped loudly. Got a hit, Miller said. He looked down at the digital screen on his tablet. The scanner transmitted the microchip data wirelessly. Miller tapped the screen to load the National Registry database. He waited for a few seconds. The information appeared on the screen. The officer stopped smiling, his thick gray eyebrows pulled together in deep confusion. He tapped the screen again, refreshing the page. This cannot be right, Miller whispered. What is it? Otis asked. He stepped closer. Miller looked up from the tablet. His face was pale. Is this your dog, sir? No, Otis replied. I found him in the woods outside this cabin less than a week ago. He was starving. Miller shook his head slowly. The registry does not show a civilian address. It shows a Department of Defense classification code. This is an active-duty military working dog, a K-9 unit. Otis felt his heart skip a beat. The air in the cabin suddenly felt very thin. War is a machine that only knows how to consume. It takes youth, it takes peace, and it takes lives, leaving behind only fractured memories. But sometimes, in the rarest of moments, the universe bends the rules and gives something back. Read the identification number, Otis demanded. His voice was completely flat, masking a sudden, rising tide of emotion. Miller looked at the screen. Classification K904 Delta. Service name. The officer paused, reading the text carefully. Service name is Titan. Assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Otis stopped breathing. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Titan. 3 years ago, Otis was deployed on a covert operation in a mountainous region of Eastern Europe. His team performed a high-altitude, low-opening parachute jump at night. The winds were brutal. The jump went horribly wrong. 2 team members collided in the air. In the chaos, the handler lost his grip on the tandem harness, holding their elite explosive detection dog. The dog fell into the dark, heavily forested mountains below. They searched for 5 days. They found nothing. The military officially declared the K-9 killed in action. Otis stared at the scarred German shepherd sitting on the rug. The dog looked back at him. Titan, Otis whispered. The dog instantly reacted to the name. The ears perked up fully. The tail hit the wooden floor with a loud thump. The dog stood up, ignoring the pain in his injured leg, and walked directly to Otis. Miller looked at the tablet, then at Otis. The file says this animal went missing in action 3 years ago, halfway across the world. Otis dropped to his knees. He did not care about the paramedics. He did not care about the police officer. He reached out and grabbed the thick fur on the sides of the dog's face. Titan pushed his heavy head into Otis's chest. A loud, rumbling whine vibrated in the dog's throat. It was the sound of absolute relief. The military had officially disbanded that specific strike team after the failed mission. The surviving members had scattered across different duty stations. Otis had come to this exact mountain range for his psychological leave, completely unaware that fate was drawing the remaining pieces of his unit together. Titan had not died in the fall. The dog had survived. He had navigated hostile environments, evaded predators, and endured starvation. He had somehow crossed borders and miles of wilderness, driven by a singular, unbreakable purpose. He was looking for his unit. He was looking for his family. And in the middle of a frozen wilderness, guided by scent and memory, the soldier and the dog had found each other again. Otis buried his face in the dog's dirty neck. For the first time in 3 years, the tremor in his left hand completely stopped. The ghosts in his mind finally went quiet. "Welcome home, soldier," Otis said softly. Titan barked once, loud and clear, echoing through the cabin walls. The storm outside had finally broken, and the morning sun flooded the room with brilliant, blinding light. War takes so much from those who serve. It fractures the mind and leaves deep scars that no doctor can fully heal. But this story of Otis and Titan reminds me that healing does not always come from medicine or isolation. Sometimes, salvation arrives on four paws, disguised as a starving creature in the snow. Otis thought he was saving a stray dog, but in reality, Titan was saving him. Their bond, forged in the fires of combat and reunited in the freezing mountains, is proof that true loyalty transcends time, distance, and even death itself. If this remarkable story of a soldier and his faithful K9 companion moved your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of hope and survival. May God bless you and your loved ones with the same unwavering strength, unbreakable loyalty, and deep peace that Otis and Titan finally found. If you believe in the miraculous power of love and divine intervention, please type Amen in the comments below.